An unidentified projectile hitting and disabling an oil tanker near Oman's Ashisha in the Strait of Hormuz. And you can see how close it is to the strait, just right there on the map. As of now, here's what we know. The tanker's engine room was damaged. The crew is believed to be safe. Now, this is according to the UK's maritime trade operations. And the news of this strike comes just hours after the Trump administration announced it's launching a new campaign against Iran, cutting it off from the global economy. They say they're going to order other countries to stop doing business with Tehran. That has historically been impossible to implement because it involves countries that the U.S. does an incredibly large amount of business with, whether it be South Korea or other countries. And it's unclear whether this will do anything to further disrupt Iran's economy because Trump has already said that Iran's economy is decimated.
They're broke. They have no money. You know, Iran is broke, totally broke. And they're not paying their soldiers. They have inflation of 300%.
They have 300% inflation. They're making no money.
So tonight, Iran's deputy foreign minister came out in response to the threats to mock Trump and Treasury Secretary Besson, who announced these economic sanctions, saying, quote, "Your narrative doesn't add up. You say Iran's military capability has been dismantled, 100% of its military factories destroyed, and its nuclear program buried. But for this very Iran, the, quote, largest financial assault in history and the mobilization of, quote, all U.S. institutions and authorities, end quote, have been necessary? Is this a victory or an admission of America's failure?" Out front now, Robert Kagan, one of the nation's top foreign policy experts, also just publishing a new piece in The Atlantic, Iran Unleashed. All right, Robert, I'm always grateful to have the opportunity to talk to you, and you've got a lot to talk about tonight. I just want to ask you first about this, though. We're 6 months into the war. Today, the U.S. investment rolls out this big sanctions plan. And what the deputy foreign minister, all propaganda aside, from Iran quotes Trump and this administration is saying is true, right? They say that it's decimated and dismantled and, right, that it's totally buried. So it does beg the question about why the need for this right now. So the question is, does this new sanctions plan move the needle?
I wouldn't think so. And also, what is the plan? I mean, we've been building up to this economic D-Day announcement, and the announcement turns out to be more warnings about stuff that we may do to unnamed countries in the future. And so, as you rightly point out, there isn't much left to do other than prevent countries from doing any business at all with Iran. And the number one country that we would be talking about in this situation is China. And Trump has a meeting coming up with Xi Jinping. And I think that's why Secretary Treasury Besson did not mention any names, because he didn't want to mention China. And it remains to be seen whether the administration is willing to be tough on China, because Trump was not tough on China when he visited Xi Jinping.
Well, right. I mean, also, it's, the whole idea of we're not going to trade with you if you trade with them, it just can't add up when it comes to China, right? That's the situation of the leverage, the trade relationship, but just to be blunt. And Iran is pushing back already, right? The deputy foreign minister calling out the threat, saying it doesn't add up, if Iran's capabilities have been destroyed and dismantled. And you write, because of this war, quote, "the dominant power in the region going forward will be Iran, not the United States or Israel's. For years, the world has been dealing with an Iran constrained. It will now discover what Iran unleashed looks like." I mean, Robert, look, that's a stunning thing to say. You look at this over an entire career. But to think that the decisions made in the past few months could lead you to say from the U.S. And Israel being the power players in the region to now it being Iran, that is a pretty stunning thing to say. What leads you to say it now?
Well, and you're right. I mean, it is probably the greatest strategic defeat the United States has suffered since World War II. So, I do think that's why I wrote this, because I do think it's important for people to understand just how much we have lost here. Look, the story was that Iran always had to worry, even though it was somewhat aggressive at many times, but it always had to worry that the United States would come in and launch a sort of devastating attack. Well, now that the United States has launched an attack that was meant to be devastating, and Iran has survived, and now the United States is out of all kinds of munitions, of missiles and defense interceptors, the Iranians know that really the United States does not have a military option right now. And that is the reason why the Trump administration is now trumpeting their economic sanctions. But that's a major retreat, and the Iranians understand it. that means Iran is essentially now going to go forward in substantial control of the Strait of Hormuz, which gives it incredible power to deal with not just the region, and all the Gulf states are now going to have to make their deals with Iran, but also with the rest of the world. Countries like Japan and Korea depend on access to the Gulf energy sources, something like 90 to 95% of their economy. And so what are they going to do now? And what they're going to do is cut their deal with Iran. And that is how Iran is now emerging as a major player in the international system from a position that was incredibly weak just maybe a year and a half ago.
What is interesting, because you're actually saying that the control of the Strait of Hormuz is a more useful instrument of power than a nuclear weapon, which I also think is an incredible thing to say, because you say a nuclear weapon might deter an attack, but control of the strait gives Iran leverage every day over dozens of countries. And this is something that...
That's right.
Well, while you... Yeah, go ahead.
No, I'm just saying that Iran has already made clear that they will not only charge for transit through the strait, but they will take it upon themselves to decide who gets through and who doesn't get through. They've already said that ships associated with their enemies, meaning at least the United States and Israel, will not be getting through the strait. So all the countries around the world will understand that if they want to be able to get their oil supplies, they're going to have to be friendly to Iran, or at least not hostile to Iran. And that breaks down the whole system of containment of Iran that the United States and Israel and other countries have erected over the years.
So the administration has applied a whole host of measures to pressure Iran economically. It calls this an economic D-Day. Are these measures, in your view, a significant level up from those already in place?
Frankly, no. A lot of the measures that were discussed by Secretary Besson today are the kinds of sanctions that we've had in place for years. And frankly, a lot of the work that he was talking about that's going on now, this quiet diplomacy with those who may be doing business with Iran, has been essentially a daily bit of activity for the Treasury Department, the State Department, and others, at this point going back decades, with a brief interruption for the nuclear deal we had some years ago. So a lot of these tools are the same. A lot of the people who are doing this engagement are the same. Really, there isn't a whole lot that is new here other than the threat that this is somehow going to be transformative for Iran's economy.
If one were to pick a country that does a great deal of business with Iran, it would be China, given how much oil in particular it imports from there. You saw that he was asked quite directly, are Chinese banks and other entities going to face secondary sanctions? I mean, he didn't say China, but he did seem to say, well, everybody. Is this administration, which is so focused on easing economic tensions with China, really going to do that?
To date, I think you'd have to conclude no, right? There have been plenty of opportunities for this administration to ramp up the pressure on China, both when it took office, now, 18 months or so ago, and then at various different stops along the way as it's expanded its maximum pressure campaign that it put back in place, or at least said it put back in place at the start of the administration, to the Xi and Trump summit, where they were talking about these sorts of issues in Beijing. There's no real evidence that the Trump administration has decided to significantly ramp up the sanctions pressure on China. They've imposed sanctions on some of China's teapot refineries, these small oil refineries, and some of the facilitators and shippers. But that's really kind of a keeping with what the Biden administration was doing before it. So at this point, I think it'd be pretty hard to say that the Trump administration has demonstrated a willingness to really ramp up the pressure on China.
Do you see an actual path to reopening the Strait of Hormuz completely? Because Iranian officials say, well, they've got some economic leverage over the U.S., and the fact is they do. I mean, with oil prices, gas prices, not just, of course, over the U.S., but those all around the world who import oil through the Persian Gulf, the administration is claiming that oil is going in there through there more than we know. Is that actually true?
Well, at this point, it's hard to say. So there are lots of people who are tracking the tankers that are allegedly coming through with U.S. support and haven't been able to validate the numbers that the Trump administration has given us. On the other hand, sometimes it's hard to validate these numbers, especially if ships are running opaquely and trying to avoid being detected. I think the bigger thing that I would point to is that with the blockade in place, with the blockade the U.S. Navy has put in place, we're already putting a significant amount of pressure on the Iranian economy. Sanctions are going to augment that and add to the pressure that's already being felt there. But we've not seen thus far enough relief from the pressure Iran's putting in place to speed up our clock with Iran. Instead, really, at this point, we're kind of at a stalemate. And a stalemate is going to benefit the Iranians.
You've argued the next Iran deal should be narrower and therefore easier to implement. So how narrow exactly?
Well, I think the most overriding imperative for the United States at this point is getting the Strait of Hormuz open to get commerce flowing again, not just oil, but also refined products, which are really now the main shortfall, things like diesel and fertilizer, and trying to make sure that the global south, for instance, can have planting seasons and so forth. And I think that to do that, the United States may need to drop the blockade and give some amount of limited sanctions relief. Be good to also get some transparency into Iran's nuclear program, some understanding of where their highly enriched uranium, the material that could go into weapons, is right now. But if our objective is to try and prevent Iran from continuing to be a threat, giving significant sanctions relief, lots of money to the IRGC, to me, strikes as a bad idea. So I think in the first instance, I would try and get the strait open, trade that for the blockade, maybe a limited sanctions relief, and then see what happens thereafter and know whether or not the IRGC is a reasonable negotiating party. I rather suspect we'll find they aren't.